everyone. Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, wherever you are. We are very pleased to have you here. Welcome to another episode of our podcast of Reapprehendência International. Our past episodes can be found at Reapprehendência International and Consciousness in Evolution channels, both at YouTube, Facebook, and Instagram. Today, we are going to explore two perspectives for our life. Existential intelligence asks, what is the meaning of my existence? Meanwhile, evolutionary intelligence asks, how can I use what I know to become a better version of myself and contribute to the evolution of others? Therefore, understanding our purpose is the beginning. Living consciously is evolving. Let's join our instructor Flávia Secato for an inspiring exploration of consciousness, purpose, and evolutionary potential. Flávia Secato is a federal auditor at Brazilian Federal Court of Accounts, a neuroscience PhD candidate, and she holds degrees in physics, architecture, and regulation and business management. She has completed postgraduate studies in astronomy education, ABA intervention for autism and intellectual disability, and spirituality and consciousness studies. She is the author of Discovering Existential Intelligence, who has lectured internationally and published several articles on consciousness studies and human evolution. She is also a volunteer and a researcher at Reapprehendência, a consciouscentric institution of conscienciology. Please, Flavia, the floor is yours. You are very welcome.
Thank you, Anna, for your detailed introduction. Hello, everyone. It's a great pleasure to be here with you today. And in this presentation, I would like to invite you to explore two concepts that, in my view, are deeply connected: existential intelligence and evolutionary intelligence. Existential intelligence begins with some of the most fundamental questions human beings can ask. Who am I? Why am I here? What is the meaning of my existence? And what should I do with the life I have? But perhaps understanding these questions is only the beginning. Once we developed greater awareness about ourselves, our purpose, and our place in the world, another question emerges. What are we going to do with this awareness? This is where I propose a dialogue with evolutionary intelligence. If existential intelligence asks why, evolutionary intelligence takes us one step further and asks, now that you know why, how will you evolve? So today I invite you to think about intelligence not only as the capacity to understand reality, but also as the capacity to transform ourselves consciously through it. So the question is, why did I decide to write my book about discovering existential intelligence? This idea emerged during a very particular moment in our recent history, the COVID-19 pandemic. At that time, we were surrounded by uncertainty. Many people were losing loved ones, experiencing isolation, fear, and profound change in their lives. And beyond the physical consequences of the pandemic, there was also an existential dimension to this crisis. People were questioning the meaning of life, their priorities, their relationships, and even their reasons to keep moving forward. I became particularly interested in understanding what psychological and cognitive resources could help people face these difficult experiences with greater resilience. How could we find meaning in a diversity? How could meaning help us adapt, reorganize our lives, and continue functioning cognitively and emotionally in such challenging circumstances? At the same time, I was completing a postgraduate program in spirituality and consciousness studies at PUC Rio Grande do Sul, and I needed to choose a research topic. I wanted to investigate something that was not only academically interesting but also meaningful and potentially useful to people facing that moment. During my studies, I became increasingly interested in the concept of intelligence, particularly Howard Gardner's theory of multiple intelligences. Gardner proposed different forms of intelligence, and most of them became the subject of extensive research and practical applications. But one concept caught my attention: existential intelligence. When I began reviewing the literature, I noticed an interesting gap. For more than 2 decades, researchers have attempted to define and investigate existential intelligence, but there was still no clear consensus about its conceptual boundaries. In many studies, existential intelligence was closely associated with, or sometimes practically merged with, spiritual intelligence. And this raised a question for me: are they really the same thing? I believed that existential intelligence could be investigated as a distinct construct without requiring religious belief or spirituality. A person can question the meaning of life, reflect on mortality, search for purpose, and think about humanity's place in the universe regardless of whether that person is religious, spiritual, agnostic, or atheist. That question became the starting point of my research and eventually the foundation of this book. So, Discovering Existential Intelligence was born at the intersection of a global existential crisis, my academic research, and my desire to better understand how our capacity to create and understand meaning can become a resource for human resilience and development. And this brings me to the central question of this presentation. Why compare existential intelligence with evolutionary intelligence? The reason is that although these perspectives come from different theoretical traditions, I believe they address different moments of the same human process. Existential intelligence, as proposed by Howard Gardner and further explored in my research, is fundamentally concerned with our capacity to engage with the big questions of existence. It allows us to reflect on meaning, purpose, mortality, our place in the universe, and ultimately on what we are doing with our lives. Evolutionary intelligence, as described within the framework of conscientiology, approaches the individual from another direction. Its focus is not primarily on asking existential questions, but on using self knowledge, discernment, and conscious choices as instruments for personal evolution. And this is precisely where I see an interesting connection. Existential intelligence can help us understand where we are and why our existence matters. Evolutionary intelligence invites us to consider what we are going to do with that understanding. In other words, one perspective emphasizes meaning making, while the other emphasizes evolutionary application. This is why I'm not presenting them as competing theories, nor am I suggesting that they are equivalent concepts. They emerge from different epistemological frameworks and should be understood within their respective theoretical contexts. What I'm proposing is a dialogue between them, because when we place these two perspectives side by side, an interesting sequence appears. questioning, understanding, self-discernment, choice, and transformation. And perhaps conscious evolution requires exactly this movement, not simply asking, who am I or why am I here, but eventually moving toward another question. Given what I understand about myself and my existence, who do I choose to become? And this connection between meaning and transformation is what I would like to explore with you throughout this presentation. So, before we move further into this dialogue, we need to clarify what I mean by existential intelligence. It's not simply about being philosophical, spiritual, or curious about life. It's the human capacity to engage deeply and cognitively with the fundamental questions of existence. These are questions for which we cannot simply search for a formula or ask an algorithm to provide a definitive answer. Science can give us extraordinary information about how the universe works, how the brain functions, or how life evolves. But questions such as, why am I here? What gives meaning to my life? Or who am I becoming? Require something more: reflection, interpretation, self awareness, and the construction of meaning. In my work, I organize these existential questions around several important dimensions. The first concerns meaning and purpose. Human beings don't only live, we also need to understand what makes life worth living and what direction we want to give to our existence. The second involves identity and freedom. Who am I? How much of what I'm results from biology, culture, family, and experience? And within all these influences, how free am I to choose the person I want to become? A third dimension involves consciousness and morality. We can ask what consciousness actually is, but also how our awareness of ourselves and others influences our values, responsibilities, and ethical decisions. And finally, we encounter perhaps the most profound existential boundary: death and transcendence. Awareness of our own finitude fundamentally changes the way we experience life. Knowing that our time is limited can influence our priorities, our relationships, our choices, and the meaning we attribute to our experiences. And importantly, none of these questions necessarily requires a religious or a spiritual answer. Existential intelligence lies in the capacity to formulate, explore, and integrate these questions into the way we understand and conduct our lives. So, in this perspective, intelligence is not only about solving problems in the external world. It's also about developing the cognitive capacity to confront the deepest questions of our own existence. And this leads us to an important point. If existential questions can influence how we understand ourselves and make choices, could this capacity also influence the way we consciously evolve? That is precisely where our connection with evolutionary intelligence begins. Now that we have established what existential intelligence means, let us look at the second perspective: evolutionary intelligence. Within the framework of conscientiology developed by Valdo Vieira, evolutionary intelligence can be understood as the capacity to understand the mechanism of personal evolution and consciously apply this understanding to one's own life. And there is an important difference here. Evolutionary intelligence is not limited to understand ourselves, it requires us to transform understanding into action. The first element is self awareness, the ability to observe ourselves with greater lucidity and recognize our patterns, motivations, strengths, limitations, and contradictions. We cannot intentionally change what we are unable or unwilling to recognize. But awareness alone is not enough. This brings us to self discernment, the capacity to distinguish what contributes to our development from what keeps us repeating the same patterns. In other words, it involves making increasingly conscious choices about the direction of our lives. Another important concept is cosmoethics. Within conscientiology, ethics is considered from a broader universal perspective. The question becomes not only, is this good for me, but also, what are the consequences of my choices for other people and for the larger context in which I exist? Evolutionary intelligence also includes multidimensionality, which is one of the distinctive assumptions of the conscientiology framework. It proposes that consciousness and existence cannot be fully understood exclusively through the physical dimension. And finally, we have proexis or existential programming. In this framework, it refers to the idea that our lives can have an evolutionary purpose, a set of meaningful objectives and contributions that the individual seeks to accomplish throughout existence. Within conscientiology, praxis is also connected to the concept of the intermissive course. According to this framework, some consciousnesses at more advanced evolutionary stages undergo a period of preparation before rebirth, during the interval between physical lives. In these intermissive courses, they plan and develop their existential programming, their proexis, under the guidance of a more evolutionarily advanced consciousness known as an evolutionologist. These consciousnesses are considered to demonstrate a higher level of evolutionary intelligence than the average of humanity, particularly in their capacity for self discernment, responsibility, and conscious evolutionary planning. So, when we put these elements together, evolutionary intelligence describes a movement from self awareness to self discernment, from discernment to ethical choice, and from choice to intentional transformation. And here we can begin to see why these two perspectives are so interesting when placed in dialogue. Existential intelligence asks us to examine the meaning of our existence. Evolutionary intelligence challenges us to transform that understanding into a direction for our existence. One helps us ask the deeper questions, the other asks what we are going to do with the answers we find.
Flavia, very, very interesting presentation. Thank you. I'd like to ask you, how do you see the relationship between these two perspectives, taking into account the psychosoma, the way we present our emotions, how we understand about our affections, and how we deal with the people that we are evolving in this dimension?
Uh, do you mean, do you want me to establish a correlation between existential intelligence and psychosome, and the same with evolutionary intelligence?
Yes, how this vehicle would influence in both of these perspectives.
Mm. I believe for existential intelligence, we can understand psychosome correlated to creativity process. The person can ask the big questions to yourself, and say, who am I? What happened after death? Or this kind of questions. So the person will be in a very deep thought about existence, and this kind of thought can bring some information, download some information. If is a person that did the intermissive course, can bring this information, download this to the physical brain. And when we talk about evolutionary intelligence, is a person, a consciousness in a another step of evolution that already have these answers about the person don't have more these big questions. The person have almost all the answers for that, and the person can move forward to another step in evolution, trying to implement these answers in in their praxis, their programming of
Okay,
life.
very good. Thank you.
You are welcome. Another question about this topic? No,
No, you can proceed.
let's move forward. So um, the other slide here, the comparison. Let's talk about this. Now that we have explored these two perspectives separately, we can place them side by side and observe something particularly interesting. They seem to operate at different stages of conscious development process. Rather than focusing again on their definitions, I would like to focus on the movement between them. We can begin with a very simple distinction. Existential intelligence is primarily oriented toward the question why, while evolutionary intelligence is oriented toward how, what we discussed before. Why am I here? Why does my life have meaning? Why do I make certain choices? And then how can I use this understanding to evolve? How can I translate awareness into actual transformation? This creates a progression. It's about that question, trying to make some kind of correlation between existential intelligence and psychosome and evolutionary intelligence and psychosome. The questions are different. First, we have the big questions, and after that, we will use this understanding to implement in our lives and try to evolve with this information, maybe downloaded from the astrophysical dimension, from the intermissive course, something like that, or inspired by the evolutionologist. Maybe it's a possibility. The search for meaning generates reflection. Reflection can expand our awareness. But awareness by itself does not necessarily produce change. We may understand ourselves very well and still continue repeating the same behaviors. This is where the second perspective becomes particularly relevant. Evolutionary intelligence emphasizes the application of what has been understood. Understood in the questions we made when we developed the existential intelligence. Knowledge becomes valuable when it influences choices, behaviors, relationships, priorities, and ultimately the direction we give to our lives. But the opposite is also important. Action without sufficient reflection can become automatic or directionless. Existential intelligence can gives you reflection, while evolutionary intelligence will show you the path you need to follow. We can change many things in our lives without understanding why we are changing them or where we actually want to go. So perhaps the most productive relationship between these perspectives is not linear but cyclical. We question, we understand, we act, we observe the consequences of our actions, and then, with a different level of awareness, we question again. In this sense, conscious development becomes a continuous feedback process between meaning and action, reflection and transformation. How can I transform myself without previous reflection? And this is the central idea I want to emphasize here. Reflection gives direction to evolution, while evolution gives practical expression to reflection. When these two movements interact, existential questioning is no longer merely philosophical. It can become a genuine instrument of conscious development. Let's compare the dimensions. Here, the comparison becomes more specific because each existential dimension can be placed in dialogue with a corresponding evolutionary dimension. The first connection is between meaning and conscious evolution. Meaning gives coherence to experience, while conscious evolution gives direction to development. In this sense, meaning helps us understand why our experiences matter, and conscious evolution concerns how we use those experiences to progress. The second connection is between purpose and praxis. Purpose refers to the direction and significance we attribute to our lives. Praxis within conscientiology is more specific. It refers to the existential programming that a consciousness is expected to fulfill during a lifetime. So purpose is broader, while praxis gives this direction and evolutionary structure. The third relationship is between identity and cosmoethics. Identity asks us to examine who we really are beyond social roles, conditioning, and inherited beliefs. Cosmoethics adds another layer. Once we understand who we are, how should we position ourselves ethically in relation to others, to society, and to a broader universal context? In this sense, identity concerns self understanding, while cosmoethics concerns the ethical expression of that self understanding. We can also compare freedom and awareness with multidimensionality. Existential intelligence examines how conscious and free we actually are in our choices. Multidimensionality broadens the context in which these choices are interpreted because it assumes that consciousness is not limited to the physical dimension. From this perspective, greater awareness of reality also expands the responsibility associated with freedom. Finally, mortality and reflection can be compared with practical transformation. Reflection on finitude can profoundly change the way we perceive time, priorities, relationship, and life itself. But this awareness becomes especially significant when it produces concrete transformation. Recognize that life is limited or within another framework, that each lifetime has evolutionary significance can motivate us to act differently in the present. So, what we see here is not a simple correspondence of concepts, it's a progression from understanding existence to positioning ourselves within it. Meaning can orient evolution, purpose can become programming, identity can become ethical responsibility, awareness can expand into a broader perception of reality, and reflection can become transformation. This is where the two perspectives become especially complementary. One deepens the understanding of existence, while the other emphasizes how that understanding can be translated into conscious evolutionary action.
Very, very well. We have a question from Leona. She's asking, how can we develop existential intelligence to ask deeper questions?
It's a very good question, but can I let just this question to the end of the presentation? Because maybe I can answer your question during the next slides. And
Sure.
maybe it's good to understand first some dimensions, concepts of both intelligence to better understand how to develop them.
Perfect. Let's do it.
Okay, so Let's see. After comparing these dimensions, we can now look at the two intelligence not as separate concepts, but as complementary parts of a developmental process. What I'm proposing here is a possible bridge between existential questioning and conscious evolution. The process begins with existential intelligence when we ask meaningful questions about who we are, why we are here, what we value, and what direction we want to give to our existence. We begin to expand our awareness of ourselves. This brings us to self awareness. We start observing not only our ideas, but also our emotions, motivations, contradictions, fears, values, and patterns of behavior. But self awareness can lead to something deeper, self knowledge. There is an important difference between occasionally noticing that what we think or feel and developing a more coherent understanding of who we are and how we function. And this is where the bridge toward evolutionary intelligence becomes particularly important. Once I know myself better, the question changes. It's not no longer only who am I, it becomes what am I going to do with what I know about myself. Evolutionary intelligence represents this transition from understanding to intentional application. Self knowledge can be used to review our choices, overcome repetitive patterns, develop discernment, reconsider priorities, and make decisions that are more consistent with the direction in which we want to evolve. And through this process, we arrive at what I'm calling here conscious evolution, transformation that is not merely accidental or imposed by circumstances, but increasingly intentional. Of course, this should not be understood as a rigid sequence with a final destination. Human development is much more dynamic than that. We can return to existential questions many times through our life, especially after significant experiences, crises, losses, or major transitions. So perhaps a better way to understand this diagram is as a continuous cycle. We question, become aware, know ourselves more deeply, act upon that knowledge, transform, and from a new level of experience, we begin questioning again. Existential intelligence, therefore, can provide awareness and direction. Evolutionary intelligence can transform that awareness into an evolutionary practice. And the bridge connecting them is self knowledge. Um, the next slide, I will talk about the stages of conscious evolution. But first of all, I want to try to answer Leona's question. I think it's the right moment to do that. How can we develop existential intelligence to ask deeper questions? For everyone, can be different, this process. So when you rely too much in artificial intelligence, for example, you maybe will be trapped by some kind of cognitive atrophy. And nowadays we are relying too much on technology. So what I recommend, there are many forms you can use to develop existential intelligence since childhood. For a child, for example, you can give a fairy tale book and expand in order to the child expand his or her imagination. It's very good. Ask questions about fairy tales, about life and death, about the about the universe. And for a adult, can be different. The person can practice, for example, mindfulness and try to connect it to the present, to questioning the feelings, the emotions. What I'm feeling now? Why I'm feeling sad now? Why I'm happy? Am I happy now? So You can do these questions, you can meditate, you can practice mindfulness, you can read books, philosophical books, because I believe the philosophers, the ancient philosophers, they had a very strong existential intelligence because of the big questions they did in the past that are inspiring us today. And I believe in the next centuries they will inspire us also. So and you can use also journaling. You can write about your day, about your feelings, about what did you do that time, that day, that in a specific event. You can make some kind of reflections. Um these things can increase your existential intelligence or make you start to develop it. I hope to answer your question, and I invite you to get my book. In the end, I will show the QR code to and the possibilities to of acquisition. So thank you so much for your question.
How about using the out of body experience as a way of expanding your perspectives about existential intelligence?
I believe out of bar experiences, the person also made the big questions. I believe it's a step ahead of existential intelligence, because the out of bar experience by itself, you will questioning everything. Oh, what is that? How can I cross this door? How can I volitate? I can fly. I can meet someone, a dead person, a spirit, another consciousness without a physical body. How can I do that? How can I travel to another planet? This is existential intelligence in a peer format. So I believe you can improve your, it's a great idea. You can improve your out of body experiences to to get great awareness of multidimensionality and make the big questions about existence, about life, about death, about multidimensionality itself. And you can evolve to evolutionary intelligence, a step ahead of existential intelligence.
Thank you.
You are welcome. So, stages of conscious evolution. To understand what evolutionary intelligence ultimately points toward, we need to briefly introduce how conscientiology conceptualizes the evolution of consciousness. Within this framework, consciousness is not understood as developing only during a single lifetime. Evolution is considered a long-term multidimensional process occurring across multiple existences, in which consciousness gradually develops greater lucidity, discernment, responsibility, and altruism. Most of us, according to this model, would be situated within what is called the pre-Serenissimus condition. This is a very broad category. It describes a consciousness that is still developing, learning through experience, confronting internal contradictions, and gradually becoming more aware of its own patterns. What is important here is that evolution is not understood simply as acquiring more knowledge. A person can be intellectually sophisticated and still have significant emotional, ethical, or interpersonal limitations. From this perspective, evolution involves the integration of knowledge, self awareness, ethics, emotional maturity, and responsibility toward others. A more advanced condition is called the deperto. This term refers to a person who has reached a high degree of energetic and interconsciential autonomy and is considered permanently free from pathological interconsciential intrusion. Intrusion from other consciousness in a pathological situation. At a much more advanced level, conscientiology describes the evolutionologist, uh, our coach in the intermissive courses. This is a consciousness with a much broader understanding of the evolutionary process, not only of its own trajectory, but also of the development of other consciousnesses. This helps us understand why, when I mentioned the intermissive course earlier, I referred to the evolutionologist as a guide in evolutionary planning. And at the highest level presented here is the Serenissimus, representing an exceptionally advanced condition of consciousness characterized by profound lucidity, balanced wisdom, altruism, and evolutionary maturity. These categories are important to our discussion because they show that within conscientiology, evolutionary intelligence is not considered a static characteristic that someone simply possesses or does not possess. It can be understood in degrees developing as consciousness matures. And this gives us an interesting connection with our previous discussion. The existential questions may remain with us throughout this trajectory, but the quality of the answers, and especially what we do with those answers, may change as our level of consciousness changes. Uh, I would like to try to imagine the existential questions of Serenissimus. I'm sure I will not understand the answers. In other words, perhaps evolution does not mean that we stop asking the big questions. Perhaps it means that we become increasingly capable of living according to the answers we discover.
I have another question. Rob is asking us if a language would be a barrier when traveling out of the body, or are the thoughts exchanged universally?
Hi, Rob. How are you doing? Thank you for your question. Rob is a friend of mine. Um, Thank you so much. It's a very good question. Sometimes yes, sometimes not. When you are facing an out of body experience, um, some consciousnesses can't are not able to communicate without language, depending on the level of evolution of this consciousness. So you need to understand. I had past out of body experiences when I help some consciousnesses in this process, and I had to speak English. One time I had to speak Germany, and other time Spanish, and also Italian and French, because they wouldn't understand me if I didn't talk in these languages. But when you have you meet some evolved consciousness, you can talk mentally with this consciousness, or I believe the translation in block is this, Anna?
Yes.
Communication in block, some kind of download of the full information of that uh, you want to give to that consciousness in block with all the information instantaneously to and you can receive this information. You need to have this ability to receive information in block and to give this information in block in the more evolved dimensions, like the mental somatic dimension. When we travel without psychosoma, we travel just with the mental body, mental soma in English,
Yes.
mental
Mm-hmm.
soma. We don't need language or symbols or forms to communicate, but in some places in the astrophysical dimension, less evolved, we need to use language, unfortunately. But it's a very important and very good question, and I would invite, I would like to invite Anna to make some kind of to say something more if you want.
Oh yes, I think you explained it well because whenever we are in the extra physical world, always remember that our totality, which is the sum of our thoughts, our sentiments, and our energies, it expresses freely. That's why in the extra physical we are what we are. We cannot have any kind of facade. The communication of our thoughts goes almost automatically. And language is more a thing that we use in the intraphysical world. It's not strictly necessary when we are in the extraphysical. And as we evolve, this becomes superfluous because the language is a lot more related to the cognitive capacity of the consciousness, not only the let's say the physical words, the use of signs and signals and artifacts of language. It becomes something more related to the pattern of thought instead of something related to a language and a form as we can as we need to do it in the intraphysical world. I hope that clarified, Rob. If you still want to extend the discussion in another way, please redo your question. Okay, I guess it's all fine. So thank you. You can continue, Flavia.
Oh, thank you, Anna, for the addition. So let's move forward with the practical examples. Um, so far, we have been discussing these concepts mainly at a theoretical level, but what would they actually look like in everyday life? Let us imagine two situations that can profoundly disrupt a person's sense of stability. The first is losing a job. Normally, our immediate reaction is focused on the practical problem. How will I pay my bills? When will I find another job? What should I do next? And of course, these questions are necessary. But existential intelligence introduces another level of inquiry. It might ask, what does this experience mean in the context of my life? How much of my identity was connected to my profession? Were my choices consistent with my values? Is this loss forcing me to reconsider what I actually want from my life? Notice that the event has not changed, but the level at which we process the event has changed. From the perspective of evolutionary intelligence, another set of questions can then emerge. What can I learn about myself from this experience? Is there a pattern that I need to recognize or overcome? What can I consciously change as a result of what happened? Now consider a broader personal crisis. It could be the end of a relationship, a major transition, disappointment, failure, or an experience that temporarily disrupts the way we understand ourselves and our lives. Existentially, a crisis can become a moment of profound questioning. What is this experience revealing about me? What remains meaningful when something I consider important disappears? Evolutionary, evolutionarily, however, the emphasis shifts toward how the person responds. What am I going to do with this experience? What can I transform in myself? What choices can I make differently from this point forward? And I think there is an important principle here. Neither intelligence eliminates suffering or prevents adversity. The difference may lie in our capacity to use experience as information. A crisis can simply happen to us, or it can also become an opportunity to learn something about ourselves, reconsider our priorities, and deliberately change our trajectory. This is particularly relevant to the origin of my own research, which, as I mentioned earlier, emerged during the pandemic. We could not control many of the events occurring around us, but we could investigate their meaning, reconsider our values, and decide how we wanted to respond to them. Now we will talk about the uh, important to show the key differences between existential intelligence and evolutionary intelligence, because they not equivalent. There is some difference. Existential intelligence and evolutionary intelligence differs fundamentally in their orientation. Existential intelligence is primarily concerned with making sense of existence, as we said before. It creates a cognitive space in which we can examine meaning, purpose, identity, freedom, mortality, and the fundamental conditions of being human. And evolutionary intelligence starts from a different premise. Within the conscientiology framework, understanding existence is not the final objective. What matters is how effectively consciousness uses its experiences, knowledge, and discernment to advance along its evolutionary trajectory. This difference also affects the instance of the individual. Existential intelligence allows us to remain with a question even when there is no definitive answer. And this is important. Some existential questions may accompany us throughout our entire lives. The capacity to tolerate uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity can itself represent intellectual maturity. Evolutionary intelligence, however, introduces another demand, positioning. At some point, reflection needs to influence decisions, and the individual evaluates what is more evolutionary, assumes responsibility, and acts accordingly. There is also an important epistemological distinction. Existential intelligence can be discussed within philosophical, psychological, and cognitive perspectives without requiring their acceptance of multidimensionality or multiple lives. Evolutionary intelligence, as we discussing it here, belongs specifically to the theoretical framework of conscientiology, and therefore incorporates assumptions such as multidimensionality, serial existence, proexis, and the evolution of consciousness across lifetimes. And this distinction is essential because it preserves the conceptual identity of both perspectives. We can establish bridges between them without pretending that they emerge from the same theoretical foundations. Um, so now I would like to introduce you the questionnaires I proposed in my book about existential intelligence. So one of the objectives of my research was precisely to move from theoretical discussion toward operationalization and measurement. For this purpose, I developed the existential intelligence scale for youth and adults, a 20-item instrument designed to explore different manifestations of existential thinking and engagement. Rather than focusing on only one aspect of existential questioning, the scale is organized into four dimensions with 5 items in each dimension. Um, the first is purpose, which explores how actively individuals reflect on their life purpose, the meaning of their work, longevity, and their place within humanity. The second one is life and universe, moves beyond the individual and examines engagement with broader questions concerning human finitude, death, the origin of the universe, the possibility of other forms of intelligent life, and our position within the cosmos. The third one is the nature of reality. Here, the questions address issues such as free will, the authenticity of reality, decision making, causality, and our capacity to reflect consciously on our own existence. And finally, collective experience examines how existential reflection extends beyond the self. For example, through concern with human suffering, collective well being, morality, and openness to questioning one's own beliefs. Each statement is answered using a 5-point Likert scale, ranging from strongly disagree, which receives 1 point, to strongly agree, which receives 5 points. With 5 items, the maximum possible score is therefore 100 points. Some items are reverse scored to control for the direction of the response. After these adjustments, the interpretation remains straightforward. Lower scores indicate weaker expression of existential intelligence, while higher scores indicate stronger expression. Um, and now here we can see um, the questionnaire for children. Existential intelligence, of course, is not something that suddenly appears in adulthood, as I said before, when I mentioned fairy tales. Children can also demonstrate remarkable existential curiosity, but they express it in very different ways. A child may not ask, what is the ontological nature of human existence? But they may suddenly ask their parents, where was I before I was born? What happens when we die? Why are we here? Or does the universe ever end? These apparently simple questions can reveal a very profound form of curiosity. For this reason, I also developed a much shorter and simpler instrument specifically for children. The challenge was to preserve the essence of existential inquiry while translating it into experiences and language that children can easily recognize. The questionnaire, therefore, contains only 5 items. They explore different manifestations of existential curiosity, interest in symbolic stories such as fairy tales, curiosity about death and what may happen afterward, fascination with the stars and the universe, the tendency to ask questions for which adults may not have immediate answers, and the curiosity about how things work. Unlike the youth and adult scale, children don't use a 5-point Likert system. Instead, their response format is intentionally simple: yes receives 1 point and no receives 0 points. We've got 5 questions. The maximum possible score is therefore 5 points. With higher scores indicating a stronger expression of existential curiosity and intelligence within this instrument. Anna, how is our time? How many minutes do we have?
We have 3 minutes left.
Yeah, so I will jump some slides to. I will just briefly talk about this slide.
We can extend about 10 minutes if you find it pertinent.
I believe just 5 minutes is enough, because it's just some kind of additions to the presentation. The most important part I already talked about it. So in this slide, I would like to show in my book what I wrote about conscientiology. There is a chapter just about that, and because Brazil provides a particularly interesting environment for studying existential intelligence, because existential questions here have historically been approached through a remarkable diversity of philosophical, religious, spiritual, and cultural traditions. Brazilian culture has been shaped by indigenous traditions, African and Afro Brazilian worldviews, Catholicism, Spiritism, and many other philosophical and spiritual influences. As a result, questions about consciousness, death, and the continuity of existence, purpose, and transcendence are relatively present in Brazilian cultural life. Within this environment, Brazil also became the birthplace of conscientiology, developed by the Brazilian physician and researcher Valdo Vieira. Vieira dedicated much of his life to investigating consciousness from a perspective that proposed going beyond the conventional limits of physical existence. He created an extensive conceptual system addressing themes such as multidimensionality, multiple existence, self research, evolutionary responsibility, and the development of consciousness. This makes Brazil particularly interesting for the comparison I'm proposing. On one side, existential intelligence provides a framework for investigating the human capacity to formulate and engage with fundamental existential questions. And on the other side, conscientiology represents a Brazilian system of thought that attempts to provide a structured interpretation of many of those questions and, importantly, proposes methods of self investigation and evolutionary development. The distinction is important. Asking an existential question and adopting a particularly answer to that question are not the same cognitive process. For example, wondering whether consciousness continues after biological death is an expression of existential inquiry. Conscientiology goes further by adopting continuity of consciousness and multiple existence as fundamental premises of its framework. And this is precisely why the comparison is so interesting. Existential intelligence can provide a broader conceptual lens through which we examine the capacity to engage with these questions, while conscientiology offers one specific system developed in Brazil for interpreting and exploring them. Um, and the next one, at this stage, we can bring all these elements together into what I propose here as a unified model of conscious evolution. I will talk briefly about this. The intention is not to merge existential intelligence and evolutionary intelligence into a single construct. Rather, it's to show how they can interact dynamically within a continuous process of human development. The process may begin with an existential question. Something happens in our lives, or perhaps nothing happens at all, and we simply begin to wonder, who am I? What really matters to me? These questions stimulate the search for meaning, and meaning provides more than an intellectual explanation. It helps us organize our experiences in a coherent understanding of ourselves and our lives. From meaning, we can develop greater self awareness. We begin to recognize ourselves more clearly, not only our strengths, but also our contradictions, limitations, motivations. And increased awareness creates the conditions for discernment. We become more capable of distinguishing what is essential from what is superficial, what contributes to our development from what keeps us trapped in repetitive patterns. But discernment introduces responsibility. Once I recognize a pattern, I can no longer relate to it with exactly the same level of unconsciousness. I now have the possibility of making a responsible choice. Within the conscientiology framework, this choice can also be guided by cosmoethics, considering not only personal interests, but the broader consequences of our actions for other consciousnesses. This is where evolutionary intelligence becomes particularly relevant. Knowledge is translated into deliberate behavior, understanding becomes practice. But I want to emphasize something important. The process does not end there. Evolution changes the person who asks the questions. Um, so, the final reflection is existential intelligence asks why. Evolutionary intelligence asks, now that you know the why, how will you evolve? And I hope I could make you understand this reflection and answer these questions and be able to implement the evolutionary intelligence. Understanding gives meaning, transformation gives evolution. Together, they illuminate the path toward conscious evolution. Um, so, this is my website and how you get my book. My book is available in English, Portuguese, and in the Hindi language. So you can get several links of platforms like Amazon, Barnes and Noble, Indie Boldy, and several others in by this through this QR code and navigating my website. It's written in four languages: Portuguese, English, Spanish, and Italian. The website, not the book. The book in Hindi, English, and Portuguese. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Flavia. We appreciate all your dedication to this study and the possibilities that you brought for us today. Um, we'd like to have you here other times whenever you have availability. It was fun to be here with you. And in the beginning of the next month, we are going to have another podcast. Also talking about interesting subjects concerning our consciousness in evolution. So thank you again and see you next time.
Thank you so much, Anna. It was very nice to be here with you, and I hope to meet you in the future with new ideas and discussions like this.
Perfect. Thank you.